Good evening, boys and girls. Today I want to talk about guitar speakers one more time. I want to talk about the most legendary high-gain guitar speaker on earth, the Celestion Vintage 30. I want to speak about the different versions, the MESA voiced version, the Marshall voiced version. I want to speak about UK versus China. And the good news is that I'm not alone today. I found someone who is even more passionate and nerdy about vintage 30s than me. I think he told me he owns more than 80 vintage 30s, which is truly nerdy. Today we want to talk about some of the myths around that speaker. And maybe you already know who I'm talking about. It's a dear colleague of mine, a great producer and mixer. He used to be the bass player in Periphery and is one of the guys behind Get Good Drums. So welcome, Mr. Adam Nolly Getgood. How are you?
Hey dude, it's really lovely to be here, and I'm doing well, and I'm actually really chuffed to be able to talk about vintage 30s with someone else, because apart from a couple of close friends, it's just been a very insular obsession of mine.
But it's true, it's over 80 vintage 30s that you own.
I think it's probably more. I haven't sat and counted actually, but yeah.
Are they all in cabs or?
No. So there's, God, you're putting me on the spot now, but there's probably about 15 or 16 412s with vintage 30s. So that's already quite a few. And then a lot of loose ones. So yeah, it's pretty intense. I basically, we're about to talk about all these differences between the different vintage 30 types, and I wanted to go on something more than just kind of rumination on forums and stuff, which is all you find, or badly done comparisons between different speakers where they're not really comparing apples to apples. And I went down this rabbit hole pretty much during COVID, starting just before kind of COVID years became my tone sabbatical. Basically, where I was like, right, okay, I'm going to get the tone.
You just gathered all those speakers lately, like during the COVID years or what?
Yeah, I guess it accelerated. It accelerated during 2020, because that was when I started to really fixate, and I was just like on eBay, on Reverb, on Facebook Marketplace, just looking and, you know, kind of knowing serial numbers off by heart, and creating databases too of like MESA BOOGIE cabinet serial numbers versus the speaker serial date codes and stuff.
You made me also send you my serial numbers of the two MESA cabs that I have, and you immediately told me like, this one is from 2002, this one is from, and you knew everything about those different years, and it was really, really nerdy, but I loved it. So I liked it.
Yeah, I don't know. There's something in my character that I want to understand, like the cause and the effect, and I want to study both. So it's not enough for me to just read other people's opinion on stuff. Like I really want to get my hands on it and experiment with it, and try the same speakers in lots of cabs, or try two speakers of different types from exactly the same batch and stuff like that. And it sounds like the kind of thing that you've been doing on your channel of late as well. So it's a good match.
I'm nerdy as well. I can totally understand you. So I also dived deeper into this when I started doing the YouTube channel, because I finally had the time that you don't have during real productions. Mm-hmm. And it has also become a passion of mine to check out all those speakers. And, there are so many out there, and it's so interesting. And I found so many nice alternatives after having used vintage 30s, which are great, and greenbacks, for so many years. It's wonderful.
Well, I mean, the speaker in the cab really is, it's the filter of the guitar sound, isn't it?
Yeah.
So by changing that, you change everything.
That's what I've been preaching for years, telling people that it's not the guitar, it's not the amp. Of course, that's going to shape the tone as well, and it's important. But if like the cabinet speaker microphone combination sucks, there's no way to fix it with whatever, getting another guitar or getting another amp. But I feel like people are understanding that a lot more now that people are using more and more IRs.
Definitely.
There used to be times when people just showed up on a gig, guitar players, they had their guitar and they had their amp, and then they just played whatever 412 they found. And I think these days people understand more and more how important the cab is, don't you think?
I think so too. And I think that was something instructional for me too, because I came up engineering in the digital age of modelers and stuff like that, and I wasn't able to mic up amps and cabs. So from a very early stage, I kind of figured that like if I had the right cab sound, that would be the thing that would really change it the most, and that would be what I'd spend most of my time tweaking. So,
and do you remember your first contact with the V30? Like, when did you fall in love with it?
I think for me, it's the sound that I heard, because I got into metal around the kind of early 2000s metalcore thing. I'd been into, you know, pop punky stuff, new metal maybe before that, although it's a similar era. At that point, the metal albums had the Vintage 30 sound, basically. It was Andy Sneap, Colin Richardson, and Audio Hammer starting out, and those guys were pretty much exclusively using MESA Boogie cabs with Vintage 30s. Although, I have it on good... I've heard from someone who really knows that one of Colin's favourite cabs, he did use V30 cabs, but one of his favourite cabs that he would continually rent for sessions actually had EVMs in it.
Wow.
A MESA Boogie cab, but with EVMs.
What, wasn't Andy Sneap also using the Marshall AV cabs sometimes?
He uses them a lot now.
Okay, but I agree, of course, that the Mesa cab, the 4x12, which became the industry standard, I think, in the early 2000s already, really defined what we are hearing today. Yeah. I can even see that when I show people other speakers and compare it to the Vintage 30. A lot of people are so used to that V30 sound, you know, after 20 years of not hearing anything else, that it's hard for them to actually like something else.
Yeah.
On the one hand, it's a great sound. On the other hand, it has. I think there's also something else out there, you know, that people should check out.
I think so too, and I think there's two things. One, it's really satisfying now to be able to have access to really great examples of the Vintage 30, because as we'll get into talking about, it's not as simple as just going to your web store and buying a Vintage 30 brand new and chucking in a cab or something like that. Like, there are specific ones, and again, we'll get to this, but the cabs that were around in the early 2000s had speakers that sound a certain way that are a little bit different to how they sound now. And so for me, my journey as an engineer and trying to get guitar tones very much revolved around, like, I actually bought a MESA Boogie cab a few years ago because I was like, okay, I don't have one. I was about to do this kind of metalcore record. I was like, it's time to do the sound. And I mic'd it up, and it didn't sound anything like any of the references that I had, even though it was 5150 with a tube screamer boost with an active pickup, an SM57 single one on the right spot of a Vintage 30 and a MESA Boogie cab, and it was light years away from what I wanted.
And that was because the cabinet was too new or too young, or what was the reason?
So it's odd because the cabinet was actually about 12 years old at that point, but I think it had belonged to someone that had only ever used it in the home. I'd bought it on eBay. It was mint condition, which is what I thought I wanted. And I think a combination of two things. It had speakers in it that were from 2005. We're going to get geeky really quickly, which is right around a point where actually the voicing changes slightly compared to the earlier 2000s. And secondly, I think they were like close to brand new, which I know you wanted to talk about break-in a little bit in this, and I can say right now what my stance on it is, which is I don't think there's much to be had in the first 100 hours of use or something like that, where people are typically talking about break-in. But there's no doubt that over years and years, they do soften. And I know what happens is, like, the suspension and everything gets kind of freer moving. The resonant peak lowers as it becomes like a floppier kind of suspension system in the cone, and everything just gets a little bit more malleable, and you lose some of the high end. As high gain people, mostly you and I, we have to counter the fact that high gain amps are putting out a huge amount of basically pink noise from, you know, in terms of the distortion. So having a little bit of that taken off goes a long way to giving us the kind of sound that we want in the mix, which is, I think, also one of the strengths of the Vintage 30 in general. Yeah,
so you mean speakers sounded warmer and warmer over the years, and that's why people like them as well, the old speakers. But let me ask the mother of all V30 questions then. Yep. So we all know that the MESA Boogie voiced, if there's something like this, the MESA Boogie voiced, that's how I called it in all my videos. V30, especially the 8 ohm version that you find in the 4x12 and the 1x12, but also the 16 ohm version that you find in the 2x12, sounds fantastic. My cabs are from 2002 and 2003, as someone told me, and they just sound great, and they are so far away from let's say, Chinese 16 ohm vintage 30 that you buy on THOMANN these days, which is, by the way, something that I did 2 years ago. And I was shocked by how bright and terrible and nasty that speaker sounded. What I know is, or what I thought is, that there's a MESA BOOGIE voiced version, which sounds warmer and just has an incredibly balanced mid-range. Then there seems to be something like a Marshall version that I have also worked with, and that sounds brighter, but in a good way. And there seems to be a Chinese version, which, at least in the 16 ohm version, sounds very nasty. Is that correct? Or,
I mean, so those are some of the variations. There are actually a lot of variations of the Vintage 30, including some that you really don't see very frequently. There is, for example, one that was made for Hughes and Kettner only, which has the lead cone. So you might know that there's lead and bass cones. They're generally referred to in Celestion language, like in the greenbacks you had the lead and the bass versions. So the bass cone is typically referred to as the 444 cone, and the lead cone is the 1777. So Vintage 30 standard in all of the regular variants that you see out there has the bass cone, the 444 cone. But they did do some for Hughes and Kettner with the 1777 cone, and that is the brightest, probably the worst sounding Vintage 30 I've ever
okay,
heard.
all right.
So you don't really see them because they were OEM for
Hughes and
Kettner. But yeah, so there's the MESA BOOGIE OEM ones, which are available in 8 and 16 ohm versions. There's the Marshall ones, which have the silver spider.
Yeah.
And the silver frame, and those actually are not called Vintage 30, they're called the Marshall Vintage on them. But they were the first ones that appeared of that design type. Actually, the first Vintage 30s were the Marshall Vintages, which were made for Marshall to put in their cabs at the time.
In 16 ohm, right?
In 16 ohm, yeah. There are 8 ohm ones, but I've never seen an older 8 ohm one.
Okay.
And I mean, historically, Marshall pretty much used 16 ohm in most things.
Right. But did those companies, MESA, Marshall, did they go to Celestion and ask for a differently voiced version, or do you know how that happened, that they ended up with different versions?
Well, I wasn't a fly on the wall, and I have spoken to some people that are in the know about this and that are trustworthy, and they assure me, and I believe them, having gone down the rabbit hole, that ostensibly there is not really anything different about the MESA BOOGIE version and the regular Vintage 30 version, and even the Marshall one, apart from the silver frame. They have different product numbers, and that's because of certain cosmetic differences. But the problem is that most people don't compare like for like when they compare the MESA BOOGIE version with the Marshall version. And by like for like, I don't just mean the ohmage, which in itself is a huge factor in determining the sound of a speaker. I'm sure you've spoken about this before.
Yeah.
16 ohm speakers are always brighter and more scooped. The 8 ohm versions will always have more mid-range, more of a kind of mid-range coloration and a smoother top end. So straight off the bat, if you just compare a Marshall cab like 412 with a MESA 412, both from the same era and everything, it's just one's 16 ohm and one's 8 ohm. The Marshall one's going to sound way more bright and present and upfront compared to the Marshall.
Yeah, but that's a different impedance. That's a different cabinet. That's, of course, apples to oranges, right?
It is, yeah. So I really do believe that when you compare apples to apples, as I have done, I've gone out of my way to get, like the Marshall 8 ohm speaker to compare to the MESA BOOGIE 8 ohm speaker to compare to a regular one, all UK made ones, because the time period that I was looking at, I guess they were starting Chinese manufacture because that started around 2001, 2002, but they were all like kind of early 2000s speakers. And you can't account for the amount of use that these speakers have had. So there's some element of variation that you just have to decide, is this normal? And then also just two speakers sound too different. You know this.
Yeah.
You put you mic up the different speakers in a 412 and they're all, sequential off the production line and they all sound different. And I really believe that the differences between the speakers in terms of who they were made for as an OEM speaker is negligible compared to any of those other factors.
So that is mainly the aging that makes that sound, or what are you saying? Like if there's no technical difference.
So I think like the most important part of the voicing of the speakers from the different eras is actually the cones.
Mm-hmm.
The cones are literally made out of paper pulp. It's a very inconsistent thing. Kurt Muller, how do you say Kurt? How do you say that? And go on.
But he's American, or is he German?
German.
In German, you would say Müller. Is he German? I thought he was an American with a German name, but that's Müller. Kurt Müller.
I think they're in Germany actually, because they've been making the cones for Celestion since like late 70s.
Yeah.
They make the cones for the vintage 30s, and for sure they're not using the same equipment that they were using 50 years ago. For sure, like every other factory, I'm sure they've modernized and made their, certain things more efficient in their production lines. Mm-hmm. And while they might be selling a cone which is the same spec, it might be the same thickness and dimensions, it's just going to have changed over time. And in fact, you can pretty much tell if you collect enough speakers, there are these really hard delineations where changes in voicing happen.
Uh-huh.
And it's difficult because you do need to be able to hear past the age, like what you were saying, and you just don't know. Like no. I've had speakers that are from two different cabs that are almost sequential in serial number, and one sounds really bright and the other one sounds really smooth and amazing. So you just know that that's the one that's had more use,
Okay, but you've been able to tell like certain milestones. That's what you're saying, right? Like,
yeah.
So at some points they just changed something, wherever, used a different paper or used different machines, or something must have happened.
It's almost like forensic investigation. And
that's what
I'm really lucky to have had some people that have laid out some breadcrumbs for me. I don't have the whole picture, but it drove me so insane that I probably drove them insane with my questions, and they eventually kind of gave in. And I really do believe the answers I've got, because I know there's people who are going to go, oh, well, yeah, the standard line from Celestion is that there's no difference between the speakers, because that's what they come out and say. And I believed that for a long time until I gathered enough of them to be like, actually, I don't think there are there's no conspiracy here.
You have already answered my next question, because I was about to say I'm mainly using MESA voiced speakers, or speakers from MESA cabs from 2002 and 2003. And I was about to ask if I can just buy a new MESA 4x12 and if they will sound the same. And the answer is, of course, no. That's what I've learned now. And what are the golden years?
Right. Yeah. Like what's the golden era of speakers? Like, so for me, it is about, so it's important too that these are the date codes on the speakers, not the age of the cab, because a company like MESA BOOGIE probably has a warehouse full of speakers. They're probably still using them a year after they were made, kind of thing. So speaker codes, if you can date them to like 2000 up till 2003 seems to be, for me, the sweet spot in terms of high gain sounds. Before that, still sounds really good. But what happens before is they are a bit airier sounding. They have more extended top end and a little bit less mid-range. So they're a little bit more scooped, a little bit more glassy. It's almost a bit more greenbacky. Now, they're not harsh. They tend actually to not be as spiky, like in terms of having sharp whistles. But they do sound a bit more kind of old school to our ears. I know lots of producers who...
You got a nice way of explaining the tone of those speakers. Just a little compliment here. Very nice.
Oh, cool.
I could totally imagine what you were saying now with that greenback analogy and a little more scooped and glassy up. Very nice. Go on. I'm sorry.
No, that's all right. Don't worry. So those are the earlier ones. There's some producers out there, like I know, for example, Brian Hood, who gets great guitar sounds. His go-to cab is a really, really old one, like a 92 or something like that. Oh. And those speakers, I mean, they probably started out really bright, and I'm sure they've been thrashed now to the point that they're nice and smooth, but you don't get that voice from any speaker like post 2000, basically. So 2000 to 2003 seems to be the change point. So for me, the cab that's always been the cab responsible for the tones I love is Andy Sneap's MESA BOOGIE cabinet. which he's used on, like Killswitch Engage and Trivium, and I mean, so many records from the early 2000s. And I know Colin Richardson used to borrow that cab a lot and use it for sessions of his own and stuff like that. So that cab, I badgered Andy until he showed me the serial number of that one. That would have had early 2000 speakers in it. And I've since collected up several quads of speakers from that time period. And at one point, I actually owned a MESA BOOGIE 412 that was 3 serial numbers away from his. So it was like...
You were so close. You were so close.
Yeah, but the thing is, it had been babied. The person that I bought it from had it the whole time, and it had not been thrashed. And it was quite bright and kind of young sounding still. And I ended up selling it to my very good friend, Josh Middleton from Silosis, who's been putting it to good use. But I found another quad of speakers from a cab that was in a similar ballpark that had obviously seen a lot more use. And as soon as I heard that one, that was like, cool, that's the sound. Tone chase over,
Are you mainly using MESA BOOGIE cabs or also other cabinets?
I like lots of cabs, but I think that for close miking, there is something about the MESA BOOGIE cab where people describe them as being like huge, I guess because visually they're huge and imposing, but actually they're more damped than like a Marshall cab. So you've probably found this. You get less low end or tighter low end from a MESA BOOGIE oversized than you do from even like a 1960B, like smaller Marshall cab, and you've got less top end. So for me in the mix, it works better. It's more of like a flat response over time. You don't get these ringing frequencies in the low end or through the mid range and up. And
if you have a good one, you just throw a 57 on it and it's not going to suck.
No, exactly. Exactly. Have you experimented much with angled versus straight cabs?
You asked me that before. No, I think I had a straight cab a few times here. Somebody brought one, and I remember one session where we actually made an A/B test. But then again, we didn't do the A/B test with the same speakers. It was like a normal production, so I can't really tell. Have you done that? Like move the same speaker into 2 MESA cabs, one straight, one angled, or?
Yeah, and actually you can approximate a lot of the differences just by moving the speaker from an angled position into a straight position in the same cab. Because there's this effect which I noticed, and I started asking designers about this, and they were like, yeah, that totally happens. That was really shocking and kind of changed my approach. I always used to mic the bottom speakers for whatever reason. And now I always mic the angled speakers if I want an upfront guitar sound. Mm-hmm. Because there's just this physical phenomenon where if you've got like the baffle with the speakers on it and the back of the cab, and the baffle's being shaken by the speakers, and there's reflected sound coming off the back, if these two things are parallel to each other, you start to get literally phase cancellation inside the cab, where if you imagine the baffle is moving one way just at the same time as the speaker's having to go in the opposite direction to reproduce that certain frequency. Yeah. And then it's going like that, and you literally get phase cancellation, and it tends to be the half wavelength, which corresponds to the depth of the cab. And when you look at like an impulse response taken from a straight cab or a bottom position in a 412, you'll see like a kind of lump and then this huge dip, sometimes like minus 30 dB in like really resonant cabs. And then it will come back up and you'll get this really big peak, which is kind of the opposite. You've got like the speaker being thrown at the same time as the baffle's moving in that same direction. So you literally get like this comb filter thing happening in the mid-range.
So there's a null there, and that is not present in the upper speakers.
It's not really, because they've got an angle, so just physically they're not getting pushed as like parallel, so you don't get anywhere near as much of an effect.
You should come up with your own Nolly signature 4x12 where all 4 speakers are angled then.
Well, you see, I don't know what would happen, because for example, like a Marshall straight cab has a slightly angled baffle. You know, it actually goes back a tiny bit the whole way across. And the top speakers exhibit much less of this behavior, but the bottom ones seem to have it extra exaggerated. And I don't know if it's because of like this acute angle that you're getting, like, because you know how low end and pressure kind of builds up in more acute angles. So I don't know if that's what's going on.
I don't know. I've never heard about that. That's really nerdy. I have to say, just from my experience, I'm mostly, or in all of my cabs, I prefer the upper speakers, but I always blame the speakers. and not the position. So I got to test that. That's
You should, yeah. It's a real thing. Honestly, on a single-tracked guitar, you don't hear it that clearly, and you know what you're listening for. But once you've got a stereo pair of rhythms, that mid-range like cut and then boost really takes away from the intelligibility of the guitars.
And what frequency are we talking about?
It's about 560 in a MESA BOOGIE cab. Most cabs aren't that different in depth.
Okay.
But it's really audible, and it's a ringing thing. So you see it in an EQ, but then you have to bear in mind that it's actually got like a time.
It's just like a standing wave in a room kind of thing, right? You get that null at one position, and then you get some ringing, which I'm going to test that. That's really interesting. Or I have to look at my IRs maybe as well if I can understand what you're talking about. There's one question that, by the way, I forgot to say that my audience has sent me a lot of questions, and here's one of them. Someone is asking, have you ever heard the 25th anniversary edition of the V30? I didn't even know it existed, but...
Yeah, so the 25th anniversary, it's literally just a label that they put on the back of the speaker. I've had multiple of them, and actually one of my favorite cabs until I went on my MESA BOOGIE tone hunt, and I still actually really love the sound of that cab, has those 25th anniversary Chinese-made Hämatom Vintage 30s in it. And because I like the sound of that cab so much, I kind of bought up more of them on eBay when I've seen them. I don't think there's anything special about it being 25th anniversary. It's just...
When was that anniversary? When was that?
2012.
2012, all right. And what is your recommendation these days if somebody wants a great V30 tone? What should they buy? Like a vintage MESA cab, or are there other great alternatives out there, or should you go chasing single speakers, or what's your recommendation?
As far as economy goes, it's generally cheaper to buy whole cabs than it is to buy individual speakers. I think that there's good tones to be had from every era of Vintage 30 once they've had a bit of break-in. You know, Andy Sneap now uses brand new 16 ohm Vintage 30s in his cabs on
Marshall.
the road and in the studio, in his Marshall cabs. And he loves them, and he gets great tones with them. They still sound like Andy Sneap. If you want the early 2000s metalcore sound, and you want it just to be there when you put the microphone up in front of the speaker, you should really concentrate on that 2000 to 2003 era speakers. The whole UK versus Chinese made thing is a bit of a red herring. There are certain differences between them, but they're not accountable for the kinds of differences that people ascribe to them. The Chinese speakers still use the same cones, the same Kurt Muller cones, which is the most important part. So if you were to get, as I have done, a UK speaker of the same ohmage as a Chinese-made speaker from the same kind of date code, and you can actually see the codes on the newer cones. The older ones don't have like a batch code on them, but the newer ones do. They basically sound identical for all intents and purposes.
I have to try that again, because I have that Chinese 16 ohm V30 that I bought maybe 5 years ago, and it really sounds terrible. And maybe I should send you the number, because I kept on blaming the poor Chinese. You know, maybe I was wrong, and I either just got a bad speaker or it needs more break-in time.
It's possible. There's definitely a lot of inconsistency from one batch to another, from one speaker to another. But I think the point that we look at really is the cone. I think that's where things are changing. I really do believe that Celestion have not changed the recipe. If you imagine the recipe includes one Kurt Muller cone type 444 and then everything else, you know, I'm sure that they're constructing the speakers in the same way to, you know, whatever spec that they can still do on whatever kind of changes in machinery they've had, but I'm pretty sure there haven't been big changes.
I remember from the conversation I had with Ignacio from Jensen, who really knows everything about building speakers. He says there are so many components that interact, and if you just change a little thing here and a little thing there, you get a completely different speaker. So there are, for example, some speakers in the Jensen range where they just changed whatever the material of the voice coil wiring or something just a little bit, and it becomes a totally different speaker, even if the rest is the same. So I can assume there are some changes just because whatever, you can't make the same paper anymore, or, you know, just because Celestion needs it, that doesn't mean that they still produce the same paper like in 2000.
The only way, I mean, it's very difficult to replicate, and the only way you could even like analyze it would be to take a scalpel to one of your best sounding speakers to have it, investigated in a lab, and who really wants to do that? So
the one thing I forgot to ask, so what happened after the golden age of speakers? You said that was until 2005?
2003. So 2000 and 2001, there's something happens. 2001 speakers are really dark. Like, I've had several quads of them, and they're some of my favorites, but it's like you tilt EQ'd a regular Vintage 30, and I love it, but you pretty much need to mic them dead center with a 57, and they will not be too bright. Something seems to have happened there. 2002, 2003 are both really kind of smooth and big sounding eras of speaker. Those are the ones you've got. If you've got those, and you pretty much don't need to go anywhere else, those are pretty much the best sounding Vintage 30s, in my opinion, for kind of high gain playing.
I'm happy.
Around 2004, it's like, and these are not actually delineated by years. I don't think that Celestion workers came in on, after their Christmas
January
holidays
1st.
And they were like, cool, this year we're going to make Vintage 30s sound this way. But there's just some kind of trend that seems to happen where in 2004 they start to get a bit spiky. Like, you start to get lots and lots. Like, every speaker has some spikes. 2004s, for whatever reason, all the ones I've tried, they sound quite industrial and almost like you're using a 421 instead of an SM57 on them. There's great tones to be had. I've used them on records and they've been good, but they don't give you that like instant polished record sound off the mic for me. And then in 2005 something changes and it kind of goes off the deep end. That character gets exaggerated. Then it's like every batch beyond there. And I haven't bought too many of them. I've got plenty of them, but I didn't go like collecting them because, to be honest, every speaker I was getting kind of post 2005, especially 2006 onwards, was just, whether it was British made or it was MESA, whether it was Marshall, whether it was regular, they were getting into this really bright kind of harsh character. And some of these were really well used speakers and they were still quite that way. So it wasn't just a breaking in thing. And then you get to like the 25th anniversary speakers we were talking about. Those are Chinese made Vintage 30s. They sound great. They've got a different voicing. I think somewhere around 2010, I don't know because I haven't bought enough speakers around then, there's some kind of change to the voicing, which I think is fairly coherent with how Vintage 30s sound now, which is a bit more kind of 1K-y, and a little bit less of that kind of like shushy top end that you get on the MESA BOOGIE speakers, where it's just so smooth and huge sounding. So they're a bit more fizzy, but it's still a cool voicing, and it's you can mic those speakers up and get a great tone and, a tiny bit of EQ and you'll be there.
What I take away is that it's not a question of UK versus China. It's really more a question of when the speaker was built. Yeah. So there are like the golden times, and then there's a dark age between 2005 and 2010, and then it's getting better again, yet brighter again.
Seems to be.
Interesting, really interesting.
I mean, I think also, unless you're playing high gain, some of these differences are not really going to come through. But as you know, it's like as soon as you put...
The more distortion you add, the more important the cabinet becomes, because, the speaker shapes off the highs, and that is one of the most critical things for your guitar tone. Yeah. Awesome. I have one last question, which is not really V30 related, because that question is, which other speakers do you love, and which other speakers do you maybe combine with V30s?
Yeah.
Are there other speakers you want to check out in the future, or are you a strict V30 guy?
I mean, I do love Vintage 30s, and having got a bit of a kind of palette of different Vintage 30s, which gets so kind of wine connoisseur at this point. Like, I tend to more likely blend multiple different MESA BOOGIE cabs or different Vintage 30 cabs, maybe using a different microphone entirely on one speaker than another. I do really like good greenbacks. And by good ones, I tend to actually be referring to similar kind of eras. Like, I think these changes that were happening, I suspect, with the cone, would have been across all of the production of cones that Celestians were using. So I have found like some 2001 greenbacks, which are by that point reissues. And those are really lovely, smooth, quite Vintage 30-ish actually sounding ones.
Okay.
But actually one of my favorite sounding other speakers, which I only ever use in impulse format, is a 1967 20-watt greenback G12M25. And I use that I capture that for the Neural Cortex. And I think it's also in the Archetype Gojira plugin, the second cab. And people love that one.
I'm not the biggest greenback fan, to be honest. I also just checked out, Celestion just sent me one of the newer British-made greenbacks, and I never fell in love with them. They have a certain hollowness. I always had problems with the low end, and there's something glassy in the upper, like fizzy. I don't know. I have used them on records, but I have been in a constant battle with them in a way, because
I agree. I think exactly the characters you just spoke about are really great for blues players or like Hendrix or something. They sound woody, don't they? And they have like some glass on the top end, which if you're not ramming constant saturation through is cool and exciting. But I do really like, have you ever checked out a Lynchback? They've kind of discontinued that now. I don't know what the story is with that. So the Lynchback, they say, is an attempt to kind of bring some of the sound he likes from his Fane speakers into the Celestion sound, because I guess that's what he said they liked. Sorry, he said to them that he liked. I don't know. I've got a feeling it's basically a fusion of a Vintage 30 and a greenback. And certainly in sound it is. And I feel like if they'd marketed it as that, it would have been really popular. But because it was like a signature speaker and didn't get marketed heavily, it didn't really kind of get that out there. But that's a cool sounding speaker.
I'll try to check it out. So that means you're a pure like British guy when it comes to speakers, or?
Yeah, I mean for metal, I've checked out. I've got some vintage Jensens, and I've got like a really old Fender 210 with Oxford speakers in it. I think they are. I've got some like Fryette, or sorry, VHT. They are actually, but the Eminence P50Es, which are made for VHT Fryette, and those are cool too. I've got some regular Eminence speakers. For whatever reason, for me, the Celestion sound is just imprinted. There's still a few I'd like to try. I know there's a couple of the Jensens that you really like and that I've liked the sound of too. And I think you were saying they have like a similar voice coil diameter to the Vintage 30, and maybe that's where that kind of timbre comes from that I like.
I mean, there's no V30 killer out there, but they are just nice alternatives. Now I have 3 cabs in my live room. So one is a standard Boogie from 2002, my favorite, and then I have another Boogie filled with like 3 different Eminence speakers and the Omega speaker. And then I have an oversized Marshall cab with 4 Jensens. And that's just so nice to have this palette of, colors to blend. And you can get great tones out of the Jensens. I used them on my IR pack. But you should definitely check out the DV77. That was created by Mike from Omega together with Eminence, trying to make a less bright sounding V30.
Because that's got the big dust cap on it, hasn't it?
No. It's actually looks pretty close to a V30, and that is a great speaker.
I'd like to try one, and I've tried impulses of it, including yours, that have been really promising actually.
No, but the DV77 is actually a good speaker. So is the Omega speaker. I don't know. People know it from the plugin, I guess. And that's a good speaker as well. Mike sent me one. And but yeah, the beauty for me these days lies in the combination. I mean, that's what I show in my videos, but that's also what I use in my IRs. Just like you said, I have used 57s on Mesa cabs a lot on records, and I've been there, and it's great. But everything gets boring.
So tell me this: would you ever not have one of those in your blend?
Yeah, totally. Yeah, I think even the latest Aborted record, which I think they have only released 1 or 2 songs right now, is completely V30 free.
Nice.
It's Mesa cabs, but it's a combination of DV77 and 2 Jensens, all blended. They went for they wanted something that is a little more aggressive and a little brighter, and then I just knew, which speakers might work together, just like your huge arsenal of different
Vintage 30s.
V30s. That's what I do. No, but there is a life without the Vintage 30, believe me, and it actually can sound great.
I think if I was going to be committing to a guitar sound during tracking, I would consider like one of my Mesa cabs with a 57 on it, almost like a DI, where it's like that's got to be there just for safety because I don't know what I'm hearing, kind of thing.
I always like to mic the upper left speaker, which is my favorite, of my 2002 Mesa cab. I just need a 57 there so I know what I'm hearing. You need some kind of reference because sometimes it's otherwise it's kind of hard to judge speakers. Tell
me this: have you ever tried a Fane F70? I think it's called.
Yeah. I think I used it in a video even.
Right.
That was good, so to say. It was good.
Fine.
It was fine, but it didn't blow me away or anything. It was, I think I tried all, they have 3 different F speakers. Was it F70, F80, or I don't know. So I tried them all and they were all good. The what was it, 70 was the closest to that British sound that we love. But still, it didn't end up in any of my cabs.
Yeah, fair enough. Yeah, that's one of the few out there which is like, people are like, no, this really is like a better vintage 30, but I don't know.
I don't think so. On the other hand, they just sent me one, so maybe we have been talking for 50 minutes about the difference, between all those vintage 30s. So it might not be fair to just check out one A70 and judge about it.
Maybe, but ultimately,
maybe.
Who's got time to do this with every kind of speaker type or whatever? And, I went down the rabbit hole and I had however many MESA BOOGIE cabs and speakers around me in my old room before we moved. It was just like cabs 3 deep around me, and I had a little island where I would sit and mix. And
where are the cabs now?
I have storage now, which is great.
Storage.
Which then leaves me wondering, like, do I really need them? But anyway.
One entire room just filled with
cabs.
MESA cabs?
Yeah, I mean, they're not in a usable position. They're all kind of stacked or whatever. Okay. So it's like, oh, look at this one. This one's from 2001, which might not be that entertaining for people, but
still awesome. I'm a nerd. I would love that. Anyway, Nolly, thank you very much for doing this. Right. Very, very interesting and entertaining interview. And I think, a lot of people will love the information you gave us. And I think there will be a lot of discussion down there, especially about the fact that the which was new to me as well, that the Chinese speakers aren't actually that bad.
It's just different.
Thanks a lot for doing this. Thank you very much.
Yeah, my pleasure, man. My pleasure. It's been really good to come and kind of spill the beans in a little bit.
So everybody, leave a comment down there if you want to ask me something, if you want to ask him something. Maybe he will also answer some comments. And let's get nerdy. Let's talk about the V30. Thanks for watching the video. I see you in hell, motherfuckers. Bye-bye.
Nice.